I've never been particularly fond of Christmas. It always seemed overblown, the cheer feeling more like an obligation than a genuine emotion. Still, this year I wanted to try make an effort for my girlfriend, Emily. She loved Christmas, and when she suggested spending the holiday at her parents' cabin in the woods, I couldn't say no. It sounded idyllic, like something from a postcard, snow-covered trees, a roaring fireplace, just the two of us, far from the noise of the city. But when I look back now, I realize how wrong I was to agree. The cabin was about an hour's drive from the nearest town, nestled deep in a forest that looked like it hadn't changed in centuries. We arrived late on December 23rd, and the place was already decorated. Emily's parents had been there earlier in the month, setting everything up before flying off to Europe. There was a tall, perfectly trimmed Christmas tree in the living room, wreaths on the walls, and a table centerpiece of candles and holly. It was cozy, warm, like stepping into a Christmas movie. We spent the first evening unpacking and settling in. The snow outside was falling steadily, thickening with every hour. By the time we went to bed, the world outside was completely white, silent except for the occasional creak of the wind pressing against the cabin. On Christmas Eve morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and Emily humming carols in the kitchen. She had already started preparing for the big dinner we'd planned, but when I walked into the living room, I noticed something strange. There was a gift under the tree, a small box wrapped in red paper with a perfectly tied red ribbon. "Did you put this here?" I asked Emily. When she came in with a plate of cookies, she frowned, genuinely puzzled. "No, I thought you did." I shook my head. "I didn't. Maybe your parents left it?" "Maybe," she said. But she didn't sound convinced. The tag was blank, so we decided to leave it for later. It felt odd, but not enough to ruin the mood. Emily brushed it off, saying her parents must have wanted to surprise us. The day passed in a blur of baking and decorating. We laughed, drank too much wine, and played board games by the fire. By the time night fell, the storm outside had worsened. The wind howled against the cabin, shaking the windows, and the snow was so heavy you couldn't see more than a few feet into the darkness. We were finishing dinner when the first knock came. It was soft, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. Emily and I froze, looking at each other across the table. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my stomach tightening. Probably just the wind, but then it came again. Louder this time, 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. Who the hell could that be? Emily followed me to the door, her hand gripping my arm. I peered through the peephole, but saw nothing, just swirling snow and darkness. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. I opened the door a crack, and the freezing wind bit at my face. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. Whoever had knocked was gone. When I closed the door, something on the floor caught my eye, a length of red ribbon, the same kind that had been tied around the mysterious gift. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was damp from the snow, but there was no one outside, no footprints leading away from the porch. Emily was visibly shaken. "Let's just go to bed," she said. "It's probably some kids messing around." But we both knew that wasn't true. We were miles from anyone, surrounded by dense forest and a blizzard that no one in their right mind would be out in. Still, I agreed. There was no point in sitting up all night worrying. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind set me on edge. Around 2 a.m., I got up to use the bathroom. As I walked back to bed, I glanced out the living room window. and froze. There was someone standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the moonlight. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching the cabin. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I blinked, and they were gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the snow, but there was nothing, just the wind whipping through the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my imagination running wild, but deep down I didn't believe that. On Christmas morning, we decided to open the mysterious gift. It felt like the only way to take back some control, to confront the growing unease head on. Emily sat beside me on the couch, clutching a blanket around her shoulders as I untied the red ribbon. Inside the box was nothing. At least, that's what I thought at first. But when I tipped it over, a single Polaroid slid out and landed on the coffee table. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a picture of the cabin, taken from the woods. The angle was high, as if shot from a tree, and the only light came from the glow of the living room windows. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a figure standing just beyond the tree line. I dropped the photo like it burned me. Emily grabbed it, and I watched the color drain from her face. "This is from last night," she whispered. The rest of the day was a blur of fear and paranoia. We locked every door and window, double-checked them twice. But no matter what we did, it didn't feel like enough. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and by nightfall, we were both too scared to sleep. Around midnight, the knocking started again. This time, it came from all sides of the cabin, first the front door, then the windows, then the back door. It was relentless, rhythmic, like whoever was out there wanted us to know they could get in whenever they wanted. We sat huddled in the living room, clutching kitchen knives and staring at the doors, waiting for them to burst open. But they never did. The knocking continued for hours, stopping only as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When the storm finally eased on Christmas morning, we ventured outside, desperate to escape the cabin. But as we stepped onto the porch, we froze. The snow around the cabin was covered in footprints, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. They circled the house in tight, deliberate patterns, crisscrossing over each other like a ritual dance. In the center of the porch, tied neatly around the railing, was another red ribbon. We didn't say a word. We packed what little we could carry and left, abandoning the rest of our things. I didn't care about the lost deposit or explaining anything to Emily's parents. I just wanted to get away. It's been years since that Christmas, but I still think about it every day. I've never been back to that cabin, and I've never celebrated Christmas the same way. Every time I see a red ribbon, my chest tightens, and I feel like I'm back there in the snow with something watching me from the trees. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. All I know is that they're still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person to spend Christmas in that cabin. When I was younger, Christmas was my favorite time of year. The lights, the warmth, the music, it was like the world softened for a little while. But now, I can't look at a Christmas tree or hear carolers without feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. It's been years, but every December, the memories resurface. I've never told anyone the full story, but maybe sharing it will make it easier to move on. It started a few days before Christmas when I was in my mid-20s. I was living alone for the first time in a small rental house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it had character. Creaky wood floors, drafty windows, and a fireplace I was excited to use during the holidays. My family was out of state that year, so I planned to spend Christmas quietly watching movies, cooking a decent meal, and maybe indulging in a bit too much eggnog. It wasn't exactly festive, but I didn't mind. I liked my solitude. On the evening of December 23rd, I was settling in for the night. Snow had started falling earlier that day, blanketing the neighborhood in a soft glow. It was quiet outside, almost serene. I'd just turned off the kitchen light when I heard voices, soft, distant singing drifting through the night air. It was Christmas carolers. I was surprised. I hadn't seen carolers in years, especially not around here. My neighborhood wasn't exactly bustling with holiday cheer. Still, it was a nice touch. I smiled to myself and listened as the voices grew louder, moving down the street toward my house. When the singing stopped in front of my door, I hesitated for a moment, unsure of the etiquette. Was I supposed to offer money? Invite them in for cocoa? Before I could decide, a soft knock echoed through the house. I opened the door to find a group of 5 standing in the snow, bundled in old-fashioned coats and scarves. They looked ordinary enough, I guess. I couldn't make out their faces clearly in the dim porch light, but their smiles seemed polite, almost rehearsed. "We're spreading some holiday cheer," one of them said, their voice as smooth and practiced as their singing. Before I could respond, they launched into another song. Their voices blended beautifully, harmonizing in a way that was almost hypnotic. It was a classic carol, but something about it felt slightly off. The pacing was slower than I remembered. The melody stretched out in a way that made my skin crawl. When they finished, they didn't ask for money or say goodbye. They just turned and walked down the street, disappearing into the snow. The next day, I couldn't shake the strange feeling they'd left behind. It wasn't fear, exactly, but unease, like I'd missed something important. I tried to brush it off. I figured I was just being paranoid. I'd been watching too many horror movies lately. But that night, as I was locking up for bed, I heard the singing again. This time, it started faintly, farther away than before. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see anyone. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the street in white. The singing grew louder, closer, until it stopped abruptly in front of my house. I stood frozen in the living room, my hand hovering over the curtain. Then the knock came again, soft, deliberate, like the night before. When I opened the door, the same group was standing there. Same clothes, same polite smiles. Their faces were clearer this time, illuminated by the porch light. But something about them felt wrong. Their expressions didn't change as they sang, and their eyes never quite met mine. This time, I didn't wait for them to finish. I mumbled an excuse about being tired and shut the door, locking it tightly. As I turned away, I heard footsteps crunching through the snow. But when I peeked through the curtain a minute later, the street was empty. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went outside to shovel the driveway and noticed the footprints in the snow, dozens of them, leading up to my door. But instead of walking away after I shut the door, the tracks circled the house over and over like they'd been walking around it for hours. I followed the tracks around the perimeter, my stomach tightening with every step. They stopped at the back door, where the snow was scuffed and trampled, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. I didn't sleep that night. Christmas Eve came, and I decided to stay up, determined to catch them if they came back. I left the living room lights on and sat by the window, watching the snow fall. The hours dragged on, and by midnight I started to think they wouldn't show. But then I heard it again. The singing was softer this time, almost a whisper, but the melody was unmistakable. I peeked through the curtain, and my heart stopped. They were standing in the street, perfectly still, facing my house. They weren't singing anymore, but the faint melody seemed to linger in the air, as if it were coming from somewhere inside my head. I stepped away from the window, my chest tightening. Suddenly, there was a knock at the back door. I didn't move. I couldn't. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Then, from the front of the house, I heard footsteps on the porch. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The singing started again, louder now, echoing through the house. I wanted to scream, to tell them to go away, but my voice caught in my throat. The knock at the back door turned into pounding, and the front door rattled on its hinges. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The house fell silent. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up on Christmas morning to sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but when I looked outside, the snow around the house was churned up with footprints. I called the police, but they didn't take me seriously. There was no damage to the house, no sign of forced entry. They said it was probably just teenagers playing a prank, but it wasn't a prank. I know what I saw, what I heard. I moved out of that house before the new year, and I haven't spent another Christmas alone since. But every year, as the holidays approach, I can't help but wonder, if I hadn't locked the doors, would they have come inside? Would they have stopped singing? I don't think I'll ever know. And that's what terrifies me the most. I've never told anyone this story. Every time I try to bring it up, my throat tightens, and I feel like I'm back there again, in the suffocating silence of that Christmas Eve. But the weight of it has been with me for years, and I can't shake the feeling that if I don't share it, I'll never be free of it. I wasn't always this paranoid, this hyper-aware of the people around me. It started that night, on a Christmas I'd planned to spend alone. It was December 24th, and I was staying in the little cabin my family used to rent when I was a kid. My parents had sold it years ago, but when I saw it listed for short-term rentals, nostalgia got the better of me. I booked it for a week, deciding to escape the city and the stress of the holidays. It was meant to be peaceful, just me, the snow, and some old Christmas movies on DVD. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it, though maybe a bit more worn down. It sat at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by dense pine trees. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of the wind through the branches. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed it. Or at least, I thought I did. I had just finished dinner, a sad microwave meal that tasted like cardboard, and was curled up on the couch, half watching It's a Wonderful Life. The clock on the mantel read 9:13. That's when I heard it, a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate knock, like someone didn't want to startle me. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, and stared at the door. Who in their right mind would be out here in this weather on Christmas Eve? I hadn't seen a single car since I arrived, and I was sure I'd locked the gate at the end of the driveway. The knock came again. "Hello," a voice called, muffled but calm. It was a man's voice, friendly enough to make me pause, but not enough to completely set me at ease. "Sorry to bother you, but my car broke down. Could I use your phone?" I hesitated. my heart pounding. I hadn't seen any lights from a car through the window, but then again, the snow was coming down hard. Maybe I'd missed it. I got up slowly, every step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. Through the peephole, I saw him. He looked normal enough, a man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, bundled up in a heavy coat and scarf. Snowflakes clung to his hair and shoulders, and his breath rose in white puffs as he waited. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain on. "My phone doesn't have service out here," I said, which was true. "There's a gas station about 10 miles back. They might be able to help." His face fell slightly, but he nodded. "I understand. It's just pretty bad out there. I don't think I'll make it that far on foot. Do you mind if I come in for a bit, just to warm up?" Every instinct in my body screamed at me to say no, but it was Christmas Eve, and the guy genuinely looked miserable. Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and let him in. "Thank you," he said, brushing snow off his coat as he stepped inside. "I was starting to think I'd freeze out there." He introduced himself as Mark, said he'd been driving to visit his brother in the next town over. His car had skidded on some ice and ended up in a ditch. I nodded politely, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. Something about his demeanor felt off. Not threatening, exactly, but too casual, too at ease for someone who'd just been stranded in the eye. Made him a cup of tea and sat across from him in the living room. Keeping the coffee table between us, he sipped the tea slowly, his eyes wandering around the cabin. "You're here alone?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "Yeah, needed a break from the city." "Must be nice," he said, smiling faintly. "Quiet out here." We talked for a while, or rather, he talked, and I nodded along, my responses short and guarded. He told me about his job, his family, even his favorite Christmas traditions, but the more he talked, the more something gnawed at me. His stories were generic, vague, like he was reciting lines from a script. At one point, he asked if he could use the bathroom. I pointed him down the hall and listened to his footsteps fade. As soon as he was out of sight, I felt a surge of panic. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every nerve in my body was on high alert. I got up and quietly checked the front door. Locked. Then I peeked out the window, scanning the driveway for any sign of a car. Nothing. Just an unbroken blanket of snow. When Mark came back, he was still smiling, but there was a shift in his demeanor. He sat down again, but this time he didn't pick up his tea. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on mine. "You've done a great job fixing this place up," he said. I froze. "What?" "The cabin," he said, gesturing around. "It looks good. Better than when I stayed here last." My stomach dropped. "You've been here before?" He nodded, his smile widening. "Years ago. Before your family sold it." I tried to keep my voice steady. Mark tilted his head, studying me. "Oh, I didn't rent it. Just found my way here one winter, like tonight." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I glanced at the clock. 10:47. Less than 2 hours until Christmas. I just needed to get through the night. Mark must have noticed my unease because he suddenly stood up. "I should let you get some rest," he said, pulling on his coat. "Thanks for the tea." Relief flooded through me. "Of course. Good luck out there." I walked him to the door, watching as he disappeared into the snow. As soon as the door shut, I locked it and slid a chair under the handle for good measure. Then I collapsed onto the couch, my heart still racing. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door. Long enough for the snow to let up, the storm finally quieting. I started to think maybe I'd overreacted, that Mark was just a weird guy with bad luck. But then I saw it. A pair of wet footprints leading from the back door into the living room. I never heard him leave.